Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight I want to tell you a story about a man who had reached a point where he could no longer see a way forward. From the outside, his life looked ordinary. He went to work, answered people when they spoke to him, smiled when he had to, and told everyone that he was fine. But behind the closed door of his small apartment, he was fighting a battle that nobody knew about. His name was Daniel. Daniel was 32 years old and lived alone in a quiet neighborhood where people knew each other but rarely asked difficult questions. He worked in a small office downtown, had a few friends, and used to be the kind of person who made everyone laugh. But over the previous year, everything had changed. First, Daniel lost his job after the company closed his department. A few months later, his father became seriously ill. Daniel spent weeks traveling back and forth between the city and his father's home, trying to help his family while struggling to pay his own bills. Then came the phone call he had been afraid of. His father was gone. After the funeral, Daniel returned to his apartment and sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. The room was silent. His father's old jacket was hanging on a chair near the window because Daniel had brought it home without even realizing why. He picked it up, held it for a moment, and remembered his father's voice. Whatever happens, don't carry everything alone. At the time, Daniel didn't understand how important those words would become. Weeks passed. Daniel stopped answering messages. His friends invited him for coffee, but he always found an excuse. His sister called him almost every evening, but Daniel usually said he was tired. "Are you okay?" she asked one night. "I'm fine," he replied. It was the same answer he gave everyone. "I'm fine," but he wasn't. His days became darker and quieter. He stopped doing things he once enjoyed. He rarely left his apartment unless he absolutely had to. Sometimes he would sit by the window for hours, staring at the street below while people walked past, laughing, talking, and living their lives. He began to believe that his absence would not matter. That was the most dangerous thought of all. Not because it was true, but because Daniel had started believing it. One rainy evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He put his keys on the table, turned off his phone, and sat alone in the darkness. He felt completely exhausted. Not just physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted. He didn't want another day that felt exactly like the one before it. He didn't know how to explain what was happening inside him. He didn't know who would understand. And most importantly, he didn't believe anyone would want to listen. For a long time, he simply sat there. Then suddenly, knock. Daniel looked toward the door. He didn't move. A few seconds passed. Knock. Someone was standing outside. Daniel had no idea who it could be. He slowly walked toward the door and looked through the peephole. It was an elderly woman from the apartment across the hallway. Her name was Mrs. Anderson. Daniel had seen her many times, but had never really spoken to her. He opened the door slightly. "Daniel?" she asked. "Yes, I hope I'm not bothering you." "No," she smiled gently. "I made too much soup." Daniel looked at her. "Soup? Yes, and I'm too old to eat all of it myself." For the first time in days, Daniel almost smiled. "You could have kept it." "I could have," she replied. "But I thought you might need it more than I do." She handed him a small container. Daniel accepted it. "Thank you." Mrs. Anderson looked at him carefully. Then she said something Daniel wasn't expecting. "You don't look fine." Daniel became silent. "I'm just tired," he said. "I know," she replied. There was something about the way she said those words. She wasn't judging him. She wasn't demanding an explanation. She was simply telling him that she had noticed. Mrs. Anderson turned to leave, but before she walked away, she said, "Daniel, if you ever need someone to talk to, my door is right there." She pointed toward her apartment. "You don't have to explain everything. You can just sit there." Then she walked away. Daniel closed the door. He looked at the soup in his hands. It was such a small thing, a simple container of soup. But for some reason, it broke through the wall he had built around himself. He sat down on the kitchen floor and began to cry. Not because the soup had solved his problems. It hadn't. His father was still gone. He still had financial problems. He still didn't know what he was going to do with his life. But for the first time in a long time, someone had noticed. Someone had looked beyond the words, "I'm fine." The next morning, Daniel woke up and found Mrs. Anderson's words still in his mind. "You don't have to explain everything." He picked up his phone. There were 12 missed calls from his sister. For several minutes, he stared at her name. Then he called her. She answered immediately. "Daniel?" Her voice sounded worried. "Hey," he said. "Are you okay?" Daniel took a deep breath. "No." There was silence. Then his sister said, "Okay, I'm here." Those 3 words were enough to make Daniel realize something important. He didn't need to solve his entire life that morning. He only needed to stop carrying it alone. That day, Daniel finally told his sister how badly he had been struggling. He admitted that he had been feeling hopeless and disconnected from everyone around him. His sister didn't tell him to just be positive. She didn't tell him that other people had bigger problems. She simply listened. Then she helped him find professional support. The first few weeks weren't easy. Daniel still had difficult mornings. Some days he felt better. Other days the sadness returned. But now there were people around him. His sister checked on him. Mrs. Anderson sometimes knocked on his door with food. A counselor gave him a safe place to talk about the things he had kept hidden for so long. And slowly, Daniel began rebuilding his life. He found another job. It wasn't perfect, but it gave him a reason to get out of bed every morning. He started walking again. He began meeting his old friends. He cleaned his apartment. He opened the curtains. And one Saturday morning, months after that rainy evening, Daniel stood in his kitchen making breakfast when he heard a knock. He opened the door. Mrs. Anderson was standing there. But this time, Daniel was smiling. "I made too much coffee," he said. She laughed. "I knew you would eventually learn." They sat together and talked for nearly an hour. Daniel looked at the old woman and said, "Do you remember that night you brought me soup?" "Of course. You probably don't know this, but that night changed my life." Mrs. Anderson looked at him quietly. "I didn't do anything special." Daniel shook his head. "That's where you're wrong." He looked toward the window. "You noticed me." Mrs. Anderson smiled. "Sometimes that's all someone needs." Years later, Daniel would remember that rainy evening whenever life became difficult. He never forgot the lesson. A person doesn't always need someone to solve their problems. Sometimes they need someone to notice, someone to listen, someone to say, "I'm here." And sometimes a simple knock on a door can become the beginning of a completely different life. Daniel eventually started volunteering with a community organization that supported people going through difficult periods. He never pretended that life was always easy. Instead, he told people the truth. Some days are hard, some seasons of life are painful, but don't make a permanent decision based on a temporary moment. Talk to someone. Tell someone what you're carrying. You don't have to face everything alone. And whenever someone told him, "I'm fine," Daniel didn't simply accept the answer. He would look at them and ask, "Are you really?" Because he knew that sometimes those 2 words could hide an entire world of pain. So if there is one lesson from Daniel's story, it is this: never underestimate the power of being present. You don't need perfect words. You don't need to have all the answers. Sometimes simply noticing someone, listening without judgment, and helping them connect with someone they trust can make an enormous difference. And if you are going through a difficult time yourself, remember Daniel's story. You don't have to solve everything tonight. You don't have to carry everything alone. Talk to someone you trust. Ask for help. Give yourself another morning. Because sometimes the darkest chapter of a person's life is not the end of their story. Sometimes it's the chapter just before everything begins to change. Thank you for listening and welcome back anytime. Take care of yourself and never forget to check on the people you love.